So I wanted to give a brief intro about the importance of lateral processes, uh, not only per se, but with respect to how they influence the exchange of CO2 between the land and the atmosphere. And here we have to be very careful because part of the CO2 fluxes are part of the natural, like pre-industrial cycle, and another part is perturbed by direct and indirect human activities. When we talk about lateral carbon fluxes, I believe that we are mainly interested for at least global or regional studies by processes that can move transport along at long distance. Of course, you have erosion, it can move carbon from the side of one field to another side. But here we are typically interested into carbon transport over distances larger than the grid of a global model, which is about 50 kilometers. Secondly, I would like to distinguish different types of fluxes, those that have a consequence for the CO2 exchange. This is the case for the harvest and the processing, transport, and use of crop product. Obviously, you have a CO2 uptake in the place where the crop biomass is formed. And then apart from the residues left in the field, the biomass is displaced, it is processed, and it is consumed very far away from where it is harvested in general, in particular when you think about international trade and cereals. The same is true for wood harvest and more recently for biofuel, which is an intersection between crop and wood products, which are specifically used for producing energy. Then we have the so-called river loop of the carbon cycle that will be extensively presented today. It includes, again, several river loops. You have the kind of inorganic weathering, you have the organic carbon erosion, and you have the leaching of dissolved organic carbon and even dissolved inorganic carbon that is entrained from the terra firme soil into rivers, and then after a certain journey through inland waters, possible redeposition, part of this carbon goes to the ocean. What maybe we will not deal with today, which is still important, is lateral transport of carbon by atmospheric processes. There is a huge amount of carbon which is emitted as methane by natural sources and anthropogenic sources, about 0.5 petagram of carbon globally. This carbon will be oxidized into CO2, but after transport and reaction with OH. The same is true for carbon monoxide related to the incomplete combustion of carbon fuels for biomass burning, wildfires, but also for anthropogenic combustion. The total amount of carbon which is not emitted as CO2 but moved and oxidized by chemistry processes for carbon monoxide is on the order of 0.6 to 0.8 teragram of carbon. And we have another 1 teragram of carbon of more like a heavyweight volatile organic carbon compound, which are produced by the vegetation mainly, and those are transformed into aerosols, organic aerosols, which have a radiative forcing and which are further redeposited over the land and the ocean surface. Maybe what is less known is the fact that we have carbon erosion. Well, carbon erosion from water is known and it will be presented today. But in desert area, there is still litter particles from plants which can be uplifted during strong wind episodes and transported over long distance. To my knowledge, there is only one study of the global flux corresponding to wind carbon erosion by Adrian Chappell, who combined carbon content of topsoil and a dust erosion model. He calculated the removal of carbon and the displacement of, let's say, dry land carbon particles. I found that it was also a significant flux. Then at the bottom, we have some lateral fluxes that are mainly moving around very old carbon that is displaced over a long distance, but it doesn't count very much on the CO2 fluxes. We are talking about the pyrogenic carbon cycle. There was a very nice paper by Simon Bowring, I think 2 years ago, in Nature Geosciences, showing that fires produce some very refractory carbon. Part of it goes to river, and we can also find it up to the ocean as a characteristic aromatic molecules of very long lifetime compounds. So this is also a significant lateral transport process. We have the petrogenic carbon cycle. There was a nice paper in Nature maybe a decade ago by Valier-Gali, who showed that basically the Bengali fan next to Indian continent is fed by organic carbon coming from very old particles which are scrapped from soils in the Tibetan plateau, and it creates significant carbon reservoirs when you consider the long time scale involved. Now, what are the numbers? Maybe the first and often forgotten process of human lateral transport is the extraction and use of carbon from fossil fuels. In total, fossil fuel carbon emission are 10 gigaton, but most of this carbon is extracted in one place, like in a coal mine or gas field or an oil field, and it is transported by one way or the other to the place where it is used. And this is a lateral carbon flux of about 10 gigaton of carbon. Generally, it is not counted because the responsibility of emissions belongs to the countries that are emitting territorially those emissions, and less to the countries which are extracting carbon. So it's a bit, let's say, passed under silence in the current accounting system of the UNFCCC because we are interested mainly by territorial emission, but we should keep it in mind. Human mobilization of crop product is on the order of 3 petagram, wood product 2, land to ocean transport by river, I think in total it mobilizes an amount of about 2 to 3. VOC is 2. Erosion by wind and water is a gross flux of 4. So that in total, when you sum up all the numbers, we have a huge flux of carbon, which is coming from one place, and it is displaced in another place where it is either oxidized into CO2 or it stays there. And in total, it's about 24 petagram of carbon per year. So that's a very large flux, and we can argue that this workshop is important because ignoring those lateral fluxes is a kind of, let's say, blind spot or cognitive dissonance of carbon cycle research. It also requires a strict accounting framework. That's what we try to do for the recap 2 synthesis of the Global Carbon Project. We try to identify not only the land atmosphere fluxes in different components, but how they connect to the carbon stock changes and how those carbon stock changes are further modified by the removal of carbon or the import of carbon related to the lateral fluxes that you see represented here for crop and wood harvest, for the river cycle, and for the kind of fossil fuel lateral fluxes. If you want to have a full carbon accounting, you need to account for inland water pools, and you need to account for biological product pools, including crop, but also wood storage pools. So I won't be long because the rest of the workshop is full of expert presentation. What we are interested is not only to have the global number, but to calculate the patterns. In this paper that was published a long time ago, I think, for the first time able to consider the distribution of the crop CO2 uptake based on FRO yield, which are disaggregated. And I considered activity data where animals are located on Earth, where humans are located, and a food to feed distribution model to allocate the right commodity to the right animal and the rest to humans in such a way that we could calculate 2 basis functions. The first one is a sink term, which is related to the carbon, which is fixed by a crop field, but it's not decaying as CO2 in the same place, and the source term, which corresponds to the carbon, which is oxidized by the metabolic consumption from human and animals distributed globally. The same can be done for wood product. I won't spoil it because there is a nice presentation about it by Frédéric Chevalier. About the river carbon cycle, Pierre Régnier and his team, and Ronnie and Hai Cheng and Han Kin Tian in the US have pioneered the completion of all the processes that are important in the journey of carbon from the atmosphere to plants, to soils, to inland waters, up to the ocean. It involves CO2, it involves also methane. What we have done here is basically take available estimates of all these fluxes and look at the spatial distribution of the emission terms that you see at different levels in dams and rivers and lakes. And they were assumed to be compensated by an atmospheric CO2 uptake distributed to NPP. This again will be presented by Frédéric, but also by Pierre and by Haicheng with the Orchidea sea lateral model. Erosion, I'm much less of an expert. We have a nice presentation from Christophe Van Oost. Just wanted to highlight some work that tries to look at the erosion carbon transport using a process model that solves for most of the important processes at a high resolution over the entire Europe. So this model, of course, has been kind of modified to be very computationally efficient by Arthur Fendrich. It was based on an original development by Victoria Nepal, and it accounts for all the key processes, the lateral transfer from eroded places to deposition places, all the way through floodplain and to the ocean, but also the compensatory carbon uptake when you remove carbon from the topsoil. The soil carbon pool wants to return to equilibrium, and it creates a call for additional carbon storage in the soil. This erosion model has been coupled with an offline version of the Orchidea model so that it is able to run in a few minutes over a very long time scale, like you can do a 1,000-year simulation in a few minutes on a laptop. The resolution is 10 kilometers. You see here a map of the hotspot of carbon removals in red, which corresponds to regions where you have a lot of cropland exposed, as well as slopes in the mountains of Europe. And the gray circles along the shores correspond to the particulate organic carbon, which is exported by this model to the ocean according to some routing scheme along the river channels. We found that in Europe, erosion was high in 1860. Of course, erosion has started maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. It kept high in the mountain until the mid of the century, and then because many of agricultural abandonment in the alpine regions and better conservation practices, for instance, in the Po Valley. Now today, the map of the difference between the present day carbon erosion removal is negative, which means that erosion carbon has decreased according to this calculation, except in regions where soil has been increasingly exposed, like in southern Spain and in the Balkans. And there is a nice presentation by Christophe and Jean-Philippe Génie. Just to conclude, how important are the CO2 fluxes induced by lateral fluxes? We wrote a paper on this where we tried to use inversions, but we realized that if you want to make inversion comparable with national reports, national inventories are measuring stock change. Inversion are measuring fluxes, and there are a number of CO2 fluxes which are precisely related to the river loop of the carbon cycle, to the international trade, that have nothing to see with what the inventories provide. That's why we mapped those fluxes, as will be explained by Frédéric, and we came up with a correction of the atmospheric inversion data so that we can compare the atmospheric inversion with national inventories. This is some result of the papers. The national inventory data are in black, and the ensemble of atmospheric inversions before and after the corrections are in green. The final best inversion estimation is in dark green. A lot of the correction has to see with the managed land because some countries do not report their carbon stock change on managed land, but the lateral fluxes, which correspond to the distance between the seen green line and the thick green line, were found to be very significant on the order of, at least 10 to sometimes 30% of the total. So ignoring them would lead to a biased comparison between inversion and national inventory. Another way to look at their importance is to say, well, now, if I have some carbon stock change just from ground inventories, some delta C, and I want to quantify what is the net land atmosphere flux, I need to add those lateral fluxes in order to come up with the full land carbon net exchange, which I call the net ecosystem exchange. And in this paper published in National Science Reviews, we have here in black, for instance, for Russia. In red, we have the carbon stock change from inventories. And then we have the lateral fluxes, and Russia is mainly exporting carbon from rivers. So when you add the small blue bar to the red one, you get a land atmosphere fluxes, which is a sink which is larger than the carbon stock change. However, and this is very interesting, in some regions like Europe, we found that the net import of crop and wood commodities was higher than the net river export, so that the lateral fluxes is a flux of carbon which is going inward from the outside world into Europe, so that it's a positive in our convention, so that in the end, counterintuitively, the net land atmosphere flux was a smaller flux than what you would measure with a storage budget. And then we played around with the different fluxes to try to analyze what are the components of this NEE that you obtain after the correction of the lateral fluxes. And we came up with the conclusion that because of several processes which are releasing carbon, but not at the soil respiration level, we concluded that the soil heterotrophic respiration is a much smaller fraction of the carbon input from NPP than previously thought. As you see at the bottom, the ratio of soil respiration to NPP was no larger than 0.8 and sometimes as low as 0.4 because of the appropriation of carbon biomass from NPP and its lateral export by all these lateral loops of the carbon cycle, so that in the end, only a small fraction, let's say a moderate fraction of NPP is able to decay on the ground by microbes. And this changes a bit the paradigm because most of the global carbon models we have assume there is no lateral export, so they will take all the NPP, store a bit of it as a net land carbon sink, and the rest will be degraded and decomposed into atmospheric CO2. So that's it for the introduction, and I'm very happy to listen to the rest of the presentations. Thank you, Ron.